Hello and welcome, star people. This is the Outlaw Astrology Podcast, and I am your presenter, your cosmic star guide, and your cosmic detective, APM. And we are doing part 6 of multiple series on archetypal astrology. And so, the last episode, we talked more about aspects and things of that nature. So we're basically doing astrology from an archetypal standpoint. And so today we're going to do the houses as the stages where archetypal dreams and dramas may unfold. However, before we start that, a little bit of housekeeping. Follow us on Instagram, Pinterest and YouTube. The links are in the show notes. And if you'd be so kind, subscribe to our newsletter for exclusive content. Also, link in the show notes. And please like, share, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. This helps others find us as well. Okay. And with that said, onward. Okay. So we're going to start off the houses as domains of life. That's typically how it's going to be explained. It's the easiest way to explain it. Domains of life is how typically we look at all houses, okay? So the houses are archetypal theatres of experience. There are 3 types. There's angular, 1, 4, 7, and 10. Succedent, 2, 5, 11. 2, 5, brain work, 8 and 11, and cadent houses, which is 3, 6, 9, and 12. And these offer different energetic qualities. So an angular house has a correspondence with the cardinal signs, which would include Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. The succeeding houses, so-called because they come after the angular houses and correspond to signs that come behind cardinal signs. Cardinal signs initiate, succeeding signs sustain and stabilize. And the signs corresponding to those houses is Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. The cadent houses correspond to mutable signs, which include Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. And so, when I say corresponding, it means they have an affinity for it. It is not the same as. So, it's like Gemini feeling very comfortable in the 3rd house and in the 6th house. Why? Because those are houses that correspond to Gemini and Virgo, and also those 2 signs are the signs of the zodiac that when we looked at how the zodiac was originally strategized and created, these 2 signs were so chosen because Mercury has sort of a transgressive, disruptive, liminal sort of energy. It's there and not there. So it's very difficult to pin down and very shape-shifty. And so Gemini and Virgo are on either sides of Cancer and Leo, and that would be a semi-sextile. So it is someone who walks in between snowflakes, if you can imagine such a thing. There, not there. Doesn't fit in nicely with duality because they're not dual. They stand for that other thing completely, which is unknown, enigmatic, hard to comprehend, let alone understand, okay? And so those are the energies that correspond. And so those 2 houses, because of the mental realm in both cases, even if you analyze, the mental realm tends to be a slippery place and very hard to pin down and understand because words are polysemous. They have many different meanings. So house systems are how this is determined. I use whole sign houses, which is considered one of the oldest. Whole sign houses differs from Placidus, which is the most regularly used, meaning that if you went to astro.com, you're going to find Placidus immediately default as the set housing system. How it differs? Well, whole signs, the sign takes up the entire 30 degrees of the house. The houses tend to be more uniform in whole sign houses. And it'll start, this first house will start at 0 degrees, and on we go all the way until the 12th house, depending on whatever sign. You know, whatever sign's there, it's always going to start at 0 degrees. Whereas Placidus doesn't work like that. First of all, it's possible that the houses, number one, depending on where you are in the world, are going to be varying different sizes. So maybe you have a very large 8th house and a 2nd house and a teeny tiny 1st and 7th house, depending on where you are. That's number one. Number two, sometimes houses will have more than one sign within it. So maybe the cusp has Aries on it, but then all of a sudden, here we go at about 12 degrees, here comes the sign of Taurus, and then the last bit of the first house will have Gemini on the cusp. And so that's a second way in which is different. Another way is that the house system of Placidus has the angles firmly locked. So the cusp of the first house is the ascendant. The cusp of the 4th house is the IC. The cusp of the 7th house is the descendant. The cusp of the 10th house is the MC. Whereas in whole sign houses, the angles tend to move, meaning that it's possible that you can have your MC in the 9th house, which is a feature I rather like. I don't need all the excessive houses with 3 signs in, you know, because sometimes there'll be, also in Placidus, there'll be a sign in the middle of the house, as in our previous example, starts off Aries, which is partially in the 12th house, but also on the cusp of the 1st, with Taurus intercepted, meaning completely in the middle of the first house, which means it's enormously large, this first house, and then a tip of Gemini coming in toward the end of the cusp of that first house and extending into the second and on across the 12 houses. This is how it's going to look. Now, certain astrologers, depending on your lineage, will prefer that. They like that level of complexity. However, I don't need all of that extra when other parts of the chart will provide the same information for me far more efficiently, giving my rainforest brain. So I choose whole sign houses. Now, how does this affect house systems? Well, if you have Aries, just Aries on the cusp of that first house, then all you got to worry about is that first house and those 30 degrees. Now, whole sign houses is one of the oldest housing systems, and a lot of ancient astrologers used it because for 1800 years it was the only game in town. Placidus is about 450, 500 years old, coming about the Renaissance period thereabouts, you know, in Europe. And this is how we get to that energy. Now, there are tons of other houses, and I invite you to explore the ones that most interest you and see which ones give you the best comprehension of who you are. When I read whole sign houses, I see myself. When I read Placidus, I don't see myself. Now, this could indeed be confirmation bias, or many, or one of the other of the 200 biases that all human beings experience in life because our brains like speed and efficiency. However, it does not make invalid the fact that excessive amounts of information in the chart make it difficult for me to see what I need to see to be useful to myself and to others when they come to me for readings, or even when I do a reading for myself. So, hence, whole signs is my choice. When I look at that chart, I go, yes, of course, I see you, whereas there's a lot of information in Placidus that I really don't care to engage with. So, each person, you must choose for yourself what's the right housing choices. Neither are better than the other, despite what other astrologers may have said or different lineages may say. It's a personal preference. It is not, this is going to give you the most exact readings and accurate readings, of which is what I have read. It's more like the astrologer got taught on Placidus or whole signs, or Koch, or Koch, or equal signs, or etc., or Porphyry, which is my secondary choice. That's a preference. It's up to you to make the choice which house feels most comfortable to read, and which one do you see yourself in? Which one do you connect with more easily? Now, houses versus signs. They're different, but they're complementary archetypal frameworks. I just said flameworks, didn't I? They correspond only because that once upon a time, back in the 19th century, Alan Leo and a few other astrologers of that lineage and time period had come about and said, okay, this is what I'm going to put onto it. That's how we get the correspondences. That happened about the 18th century, and Alan Leo and compatriots said first house Aries, second house Taurus, third house Gemini, etc., 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 only because Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, particularly in the northern hemisphere, and it kicks off spring and the spring equinox. It is the reversed in the southern hemisphere, and so since these are northern hemisphere astrologers, even ancient astrology was northern hemisphere, they're looking at the same stars those of us in the northern hemisphere are looking at. This is the reference and the lineage I'm looking at as well. So just because Mars is the guide, the guiding planet, the shot caller of Aries, does not necessarily mean it's the same energy or the same thing as Aries itself. Okay, so I feel the need to make that difference. Planet, house, sign are complementary, but they are very different things. The house is the stage. It is the environment in which the planet, which is our character, and the sign, which is our costume, are playing out the whatever dramas, comedies, action, adventure, etc. is occurring. Okay, so let's briefly go into it. So the first house is the arena of self-expression and identity. So I would just say identity. Now you're also going to hear different lineages also mention personal appearance. I do not happen to practice that particular lineage, so you're not going to hear me say that after saying what I just said momentarily. So the first house is, we could see that as kind of the pioneer, and this is about self-awareness and how we approach the world. It's also how we see ourselves. It is the beginning of the journey. It is about self-discovery, and that pioneer is moving forward with courage and self-direction. The second house is the steward. This is connected to values, resources, and how we find security in this life. The archetype manages what we possess, so both material and non-material. The steward understands worth in the process of cultivating sustainable resources. House 3, the messenger, relates to communication, learning, immediate environment, and also childhood education. And this archetype collects and distributes and disseminates information, making connections between ideas. So also a pattern maker. The messenger facilitates understanding through various forms of expression. The fourth house I call the root system. I've also heard it called the taproot. And it symbolizes our emotional foundations, our home life, our ancestral roots, our early home life as well. And this archetype provides care, emotional security, and creates a sense of belonging. And so the root system helps us understand our deepest emotional needs, and that is very important to a life well lived. The fifth house is the artist, and it represents creative self-expression, joy, and things that give us delight, also pleasure. Once upon a time, in curious note, Venus is considered by certain lineages, meaning in Hellenized astrology or traditional astrology, meaning Greek-oriented astrology, Venus was seen to be in its joy in the fifth house, which is how you get delight and how you get pleasure, because Venus is the pleasure planet, and some of the keywords from the fifth house predate Alan Leo and the 19th century astrologers reassigning houses and affinities, okay? So the whole point of the fifth house is celebrating individuality through authentic self-expression. The sixth house is the craftsperson or the workshop. And it's connected, I would say the workshop would be a better choice. I put craftsperson, but I like workshop better. And so it's connected to our daily work, our healthy routines, and how we contribute our artistry, how we express our unique authenticity, our unique authentic selves, how we contribute to the collective. And this archetype refines skills through patience, dedication. And so the workshop finds meaning in improvement, organization, and contribution. Okay? So let's move forward into the relational and collective houses. Another word, keywords for these are the personal houses would be 1 through 6. The transpersonal houses would be 7 through 12. I love transpersonal houses rather than relational or collective houses, but there you go. So, to give a quick overview, the first house is the seventh house is partnerships and the mirror of others. So, we're looking at the connector, or the place of connection. So like a networking event is how we could see this. And it represents our approach to relationships, one-on-one connections, which are not limited to marriage or sexual relationships. It is also collaborations, long-term contracts, people that we work with on the long term is seventh house. So it's not limited to just relationships, which is why I find it troubling when people stereotype Librans as relationship-oriented, which is, in my opinion, in the lineage of astrology I practice, inaccurate. But moving on, I digress. So, the archetype, the networking event, or the networker, it embodies cooperation, compromise, and also the balance between ourselves and other, and partners, meaning collaborators, which is another way of saying this. Collaborators seeking harmony through mutual exchange. It shows us our reflection through others. Now, the house 8 is the transformer, but it's also the veil. That's what I call it. And it's connected to shared resources, intimacy, which can include sex and profound change. In addition to grief, loss, and heartbreak, because change isn't always comfortable, and sometimes we lose things, even though we may gain better things in the long run. In the short term, there's going to be some discomfort and therefore some upset, which could lead to grief, to loss, etc. And this archetype navigates the depths of psychological transformation and regeneration, and so the veil, or the transformer, embraces endings as necessary for rebirth and comprehends the power that comes from merging resources. Now, House 9 is the house of expansion. And when I see House 9, I see a really tall library filled with every book of every description, from the books written to the books never written to the books that will be written, and a gorgeous library filled with books and magical tomes all. So I see it as the library, is how I would see that. And it relates to higher education, philosophy, expanded worldviews. The archetype explores meaning beyond the immediate and the familiar. The seeker and the library pursues truth through diverse perspectives and experiences that broaden understanding. And so House 10 is the builder, or the architect, or even the architect the architectural workshop. But let's just go with builder. And so this symbolizes the public image, the career path, and contribution to society. I make a note here. In certain lineages of astrology, you're going to hear that the mask is that first house. And why am I mentioning it? Because the mask we wear socially is how the first house is interpreted in certain lineages of astrology. And we don't need a mask because the MC in the 10th house represent how others see us. So it talks about our contribution to society. And this archetype constructs lasting structures and achievements that can be recognized by the collective. So the builder works towards manifestation of purpose through discipline and responsibility. The 11th house is the visionary, and this is our social networks, the aspirations, our humanitarian ideals. This archetype perceives possibilities beyond current limitations and connects with collective movements. And so the visionary recognizes patterns that link individual goals with collective progress. House 12 is the mystic, connected to our unconscious, spiritual dissolution, the hidden realms. And this archetype transcends everyday boundaries and accesses cosmic consciousness. And the mystic surrenders personal identity to experience connection with all that exists beyond the illusion of separation. Okay? So those are the archetypes of the different houses. Now, here's what I'm thinking. I'm not presenting these so that they can just be adopted or, without critical thought. These are merely jumping off points, even for me. I am a neurodiverse person, neurospicy. I have a rainforest mind. And this, for me, is a jumping off point. I am never going to have that moment when I say, House 9 definitely means this. Absolutely. That never happens for me. It has never happened for me. It's probably, it's probably just not going to be. So this is an invitation to see, hear what I say, and get you thinking. How do you identify the first house? How do you identify the 4th house? How do you identify the 7th house? With which archetypes? What names would you use? The reason why archetypes are very useful is because they are at the center of every great story ever told. Ever told. The coming of age story is an archetypal journey. The hero's journey, which we often hear about if you ever study writing in any degree or even just have a mild interest in it as a hobby, you're going to hear that story mentioned. That's Joseph Campbell popularized this structure, but did not invent it. He merely pointed it out so everyone else can notice. But there's also the heroine's journey, exactly. And so even stories can be archetypal. I mean, if I say the Cinderella story, for example, everyone knows what I mean. It's a very old story, by the way, a good 5,000 years old, so very, very old, and depending on its lineage, meaning wherever it happens to be culturally in the world, the story will change to accommodate that particular culture. So it's not just a Western European story, it's a story that has been told in many different cultures all over the world for the past millennia plus. And so archetypes are very useful because they're rather like heuristic, meaning a mental shortcut. It can also be a shortcut in astrology to help us better understand, because the mind is wired. The brain, let me rephrase that. The brain is wired for story. There's actually books on that, of that very title, on Amazon, of all places, and on Powell's and other places, books, 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 okay. Wherever you wherever you buy your books, if you looked, you can find that title, because human beings are wired to tell stories. Why? Because when we looked up in the sky thousands of years ago, we told a story about what we saw, which is how some of the constellations got their names, and how mythology blossomed and bloomed. And those stories led to beliefs and orthodoxies and other frameworks to better help us understand the world, the cosmos, and our place in it. So stories are very useful, and archetypes are useful because they help us better understand a story. Now, Cinderella, very common story, but sometimes you'll notice a story. For example, Harry Potter. I'm a huge fan of Harry Potter. Love the books. I've read them many, many times. I've seen the films many, many times, and probably will watch it again every October, as I do that as my custom. But Harry Potter's story is a Cinderella story, because he starts out being treated very much like Cinderella was treated by the so-called wicked stepmom and the so-called wicked stepsisters, being forced to do all of the work, being treated like a slave, being treated very poorly, very badly, and didn't seem to have many rights, and nobody seemed to consider Harry's feelings, much like Cinderella. So if you look back into that story, you'll see the archetypal story of Cinderella as part of a coming-of-age story. And a coming-of-age story is an archetypal story, as I've said, and it's a story of finding one's identity, which is a first house thing. So as you see, archetypes can be very useful in helping you understand yourself and understand people, because everybody on this planet, and everybody who ever was on this planet, and everybody who will be on this planet, is telling a story about themselves, and in which they are the hero, which is an archetype, a villain, a trickster, a comedian, the class clown, the jock, the princess, the cheerleader, etc. These are all archetypes that when I say them, the stoner, etc., everyone listening will have a picture or a name or a person that archetype makes them think of. So, very useful in astrology. Now, here's the part where I leave us all with some key insights. And so, one of those is that archetypal containers can be vessels. They help you better understand, better comprehend a story, and better comprehend your story. Like, say, for example, I know someone very close to me whose story is the ugly duckling. And that is an archetypal story, because if you watch a film or a book, you will find the ugly duckling. Harry Potter, for example, he was a magical person put in with a bunch of people who are non-magical. So the ugly duckling story and Cinderella are both very true stories for that coming-of-age story about a young wizard trying to sort out who he is, whilst also trying to stay alive. So the practical application could be identifying active house transits in your life. That would be one way to do it. But I encourage all of you listening to find your own archetypes for the houses, to find your own names, to find your own keys, because your chart has its own keys and its own locks. It has its own magic and its own rules and methods for understanding it that are going to be quite different from all other charts, including my own. So finding out the names, the archetypes that speak to you for your own house placements is ideal. Okay, so we have a newsletter once again. So if you want daily transits, secondary progressions, all that sort of thing, you're going to find that in the newsletter, link in the show notes. And the next episode is part 7, will be on the angles in archetypal astrology. And please check out our Pinterest and YouTube and Instagram. Love to have you. I want to have more conversations on astrology. I'm totally a geek. And thank you very much for listening. And until next week, keep your feet on the ground and your eyes to the stars. Peace and astral magic.